The sleek glass doors of Next Tech Solutions slide open as Dayan Jackson steps inside, his Navy delivery uniform a stark contrast to the pristine white walls and polished concrete floors. He's carrying a stack of packages, but what catches his attention isn't his delivery route, it's the chaos erupting from the engineering lab to his right. "This is impossible." Mark Thompson's voice echoes through the corridor as he slams his tablet down on the workbench. 20 engineers, 6 months, and we still can't get these drones to maintain stable flight patterns for more than 30 seconds. Dayan pauses, his trained eyes scanning the scattered drone components and frustrated faces through the glass partition. What happened next shocked everyone, but little did the engineers know that the solution to their million-dollar problem was standing right outside their door. "Sir, your delivery." Dayan calls out, holding up an envelope marked urgent. Mark barely glances up as he storms over. "Just leave it on the desk," he mutters, then returns to his team of exhausted engineers clustered around a prototype drone that's smoking slightly from its latest crash landing. But Dayan doesn't leave. Something about the chaotic workspace draws him closer. His father Lorenzo's voice echoes in his mind from years of tinkering in their garage. "Son, sometimes the simplest problems have the most complicated explanations." "Excuse me," Dayan says, stepping into the lab. "I couldn't help but notice your stabilization issue." The room falls silent. Every engineer turns to stare at this delivery driver who just walked into their sacred space. Mark's eyebrows furrow as he looks Dayan up and down, taking in the uniform, the delivery bag still slung over his shoulder. "I'm sorry, but this is a restricted area," Mark says coldly. "We're dealing with advanced aerospace engineering here." "I understand that," Dayan replies calmly, his eyes never leaving the damaged drone. "But from what I can see, you're fighting against the natural physics instead of working with them." A few engineers exchange glances. One of them, a young woman with curly red hair and thick-rimmed glasses, leans forward slightly. This is Clara Edwards, and she's been questioning Mark's approach for weeks. "What do you mean?" Clara asks, ignoring Mark's sharp look. Dayan approaches the workbench slowly, like he's approaching a wounded bird. "Your gyroscopic stabilizers are fighting each other instead of communicating. It's like having two pilots trying to fly the same plane without talking to each other." Mark scoffs. "Look, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have PhD-level engineers who've been working on this problem for months. I don't think a delivery driver is going to solve what 20 brilliant minds couldn't figure out." The words hang in the air like a challenge. But what happened next shocked everyone in that room. Dayan doesn't flinch. Instead, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small notebook, its pages filled with detailed sketches and equations. "My father Lorenzo Jackson was a NASA contractor for 15 years before budget cuts forced him into factory work," he says quietly. "He taught me that the best solutions usually come from understanding the fundamentals, not adding more complexity." Clara's eyes widen as she glimpses the notebook. The equations are sophisticated, the diagrams precise and innovative. This decision would change everything, though none of them realize it yet. "You know what?" Mark's voice drips with condescension. "If you think you're so smart, why don't you take a look at our complete failure log? Maybe that'll show you what real engineering looks like." But Dayan is already studying the drone, his mind racing through possibilities his father taught him to see. The other engineers watch in stunned silence as this outsider examines their work with the confidence of someone who truly understands what he's looking at. "I can fix this," Dayan says simply. The room erupts in uncomfortable laughter, but Clara isn't laughing. She's watching Dayan's face, seeing something the others are missing. There's no arrogance there, no showboating, just quiet certainty. Mark crosses his arms. "Right. And I suppose you want us to just hand over months of proprietary research to a delivery driver who thinks he knows better than our entire team?" "I don't want anything," Dayan replies, closing his notebook. "But that drone will never fly stable with its current configuration. The problem isn't in your code or your hardware, it's in your fundamental approach." Little did Mark know that this conversation would expose everything wrong with his leadership, and that Dayan's casual confidence was backed by years of hands-on experience that no classroom could provide. As Dan heads toward the exit, he pauses at the door. "When you're ready to try something different, you know where to find me. I deliver here every Tuesday and Thursday." The lab falls silent again as Dan disappears down the corridor. Mark stares at the smoking drone, his jaw clenched, while Clara quietly picks up a piece of paper Dan accidentally dropped. Her eyes go wide as she recognizes the elegant solution sketched across the page. But the real shock was still coming, and it would change not just the drone project, but everything about how this team viewed innovation, expertise, and the power of an open mind. The silence in the engineering lab is deafening as Mark Thompson slumps against the whiteboard, staring at the maze of equations and crossed-out diagrams covering every inch of the surface. 20 failed prototypes sit scattered across workbenches like technological graveyard markers, each one representing weeks of effort and mounting frustration. 3 months, Mark mutters to his team of exhausted engineers. 3 months of 18-hour days, and we're still nowhere close to solving the stabilization issue. The delivery drones either crash within 30 seconds or fly so erratically they couldn't deliver a pizza to the building next door. Sarachan, one of the senior engineers, rubs her temples. "Maybe we're overthinking this. The gyroscopic sensors should be handling the weight distribution automatically." "Should be doesn't cut it," Mark snaps, his patience wearing thin. "Corporate wants results, not theories. If we can't crack this by next week, they're pulling the plug on the entire project." But what Mark doesn't know is that outside in the parking lot, Dan Jackson sits in his delivery van, sketching furiously in a worn notebook. His mind races back to childhood memories that flood through him like a documentary reel. He's 8 years old again, standing in his father's cramped garage in Detroit. Lorenzo Jackson, a brilliant aerospace engineer who'd been laid off during the industry downturn, tinkers with remote-controlled helicopters at a makeshift workbench. "You see, son," his father's voice echoes in his memory, "balance isn't just about weight distribution. It's about understanding the harmony between lift, thrust, and the natural patterns of air resistance." Most engineers get so caught up in the mathematics, they forget to listen to what the machine is trying to tell them. Young Dan watches in fascination as his father makes seemingly impossible adjustments to a helicopter that had been spinning out of control moments before. With just a few tweaks to the rotor angle and a repositioned weight, the aircraft suddenly flies with graceful precision. "How did you know to do that, Dad?" Lorenzo smiles, his weathered hands still steady despite years of disappointment. "Sometimes the simplest solutions hide in plain sight. You just have to be willing to see what others overlook." Back in the present, Dan closes his notebook and glances at the engineering building. Through the large windows, he can see the team still huddled around their failed prototypes, their body language screaming defeat. What they don't notice is Clara Edwards, a junior engineer fresh out of MIT, watching from the corner. She's been with the company for only 6 months, but she's already learned to question everything. While her colleagues focus on complex algorithms and advanced sensors, she finds herself drawn to the simplicity that others dismiss. During her lunch break, Clara steps outside for fresh air and notices Dan sitting in his van. But here's what stops her cold: through his open window, she catches a glimpse of his notebook. The sketches are incredibly detailed, showing drone configurations she's never seen before, with annotations about airflow dynamics that make her pulse quicken. "Excuse me," she calls out, walking over to his van. "I'm Clara from the engineering team upstairs. I couldn't help but notice your drawings. Are those drone designs?" Dan looks up, surprised. Most people in this building barely acknowledge his existence beyond signing for packages. "Oh, these? Just some ideas I was playing around with. I've been listening to you folks talk about your stabilization problems during my deliveries." Clara's eyes widen as she studies his sketches more closely. The elegance of his approach is breathtaking. Instead of fighting against natural air currents, his design works with them, creating a self-correcting system that seems almost organic. "This is incredible," she whispers. "The way you've positioned the rotors to create a natural gyroscopic effect, we've been approaching this completely wrong." But their conversation is interrupted by Mark's voice booming from the building entrance. "Edwards! Break time's over." We've got another prototype to test and probably watch crash. Clara quickly hands back the notebook, but not before tearing a small piece of paper from her pocket and scribbling her phone number. "Call me tonight," she whispers urgently. "I think you might be the solution we've been looking for." As Dan drives away to complete his remaining deliveries, Clara returns to the lab with a new energy. She watches her colleagues continue their futile attempts, and for the first time, she realizes they're all trapped in the same thought patterns, unable to see beyond their conventional engineering education. That evening, Clara finds herself pacing her apartment, waiting for Dan's call. When her phone finally rings, she answers before the first ring finishes. "I've been thinking about what you showed me," she begins without preamble. "What if everything we've been taught about drone stabilization is wrong?" The fluorescent lights buzz overhead as Clara sits at her desk, staring at the schematics she discovered tucked between delivery boxes. The intricate detail, the elegant solutions, the annotations in Dan's careful handwriting, it's unlike anything she's seen from the engineering team in months. "This can't be right," she whispers, but deep down she knows it is. Every calculation checks out, every component placement makes perfect sense. She glances around the office, making sure Mark isn't watching, then slips the paper into her jacket. The next morning, Clara approaches Dan as he sorts packages in the loading bay. Her heart pounds as she unfolds his schematic. "I found this," she says quietly. "Did you really design this?" Dan's face flushes with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have left that lying around. I was just thinking." "Thinking?" Clara's voice rises with excitement. "Dan, this could actually work. The way you've reconfigured the stabilization system, it's brilliant. We've been approaching this all wrong." For a moment, Dan studies her face, searching for any hint of mockery. Instead, he sees genuine respect, something he hasn't encountered from anyone in this building except the security guard. "You really think so?" he asks. "I know so. Look, I've been an engineer for 3 years, and I've never seen Mark this frustrated. We're running out of time, and frankly, out of ideas." Clara leans closer. "Would you be willing to work with me on this? After hours, when the office is empty." That evening, Clara unlocks a small conference room tucked away on the second floor. She's gathered components, tools, and her laptop. When Dan arrives, still in his delivery uniform, he carries a worn toolbox that belonged to his father. "My dad always said the right tools are half the solution," Dan explains, setting the box on the table. For the next week, they meet in secret. Clara watches in amazement as Dan's hands move with surgical precision, adjusting components with an intuition that defies his lack of formal training. But you wouldn't need formal training to see the genius in his approach. Where the team had been adding complexity, Dan strips it away, finding elegant simplicity. "The problem isn't the technology," Dan explains one evening, holding up a circuit board. "It's that everyone's trying to reinvent the wheel when what we need is a better axle." Clara nods, understanding flooding her face. "You're talking about the power distribution system. We've been focusing on the flight mechanics, but the real issue is energy efficiency." "Exactly. My dad used to say, find where the machine is fighting itself, and you'll find your answer." But their secret collaboration weighs heavily on Dan's conscience. Every morning, he watches Mark pace frantically around the lab, barking orders at increasingly demoralized engineers. The man is drowning, and Dan holds the life preserver. "Clara, I don't feel right about this," Dan admits during one late-night session. "Mark's struggling, and I'm sitting here with a solution." "Mark had his chance to listen to you," Clara responds. "He dismissed you without even considering your ideas." "But what if I'm wrong? What if I speak up and make things worse for everyone?" Before Clara can respond, they hear footsteps in the hallway. Both freeze as the sound grows closer, then fades away. The close call reminds them both of the risk they're taking. The next day brings devastating news. Mark gathers the team for what he calls a breakthrough presentation. His latest design features an overly complex stabilization system with 17 individual components working in sequence. "This is it," Mark announces confidently. This will solve all our problems. The test begins with promise. The drone lifts off smoothly, hovers steadily, then begins its programmed route. For 30 seconds, it performs perfectly. Then, catastrophically, it begins to wobble. The overcomplicated stabilization system fights against itself, each component trying to correct the others, creating a feedback loop that sends the drone spinning wildly before it crashes into the wall. The silence that follows is deafening. Mark stares at the wreckage, his face pale. I don't understand. The simulations were perfect. Maybe that's the problem, Clara says quietly. Maybe we're overthinking this. Mark's head snaps toward her. Overthinking? Clara, this is precision engineering, not guesswork. From across the room, Dan watches the defeat wash over Mark's face, sees the way the other engineers avoid eye contact. He thinks about his father's words, about finding where the machine fights itself. But he also thinks about pride, about knowing when to step forward and when to step back. That evening, as the office empties, Dan makes his decision. He finds Clara packing up her things. It's time, he says simply. Time for what? Dan squares his shoulders, determination replacing the uncertainty in his voice. It's time to show them what we've got. The morning sun cast long shadows across the engineering lab as Dan stood before the assembled team, his prototype drone sitting quietly on the test table. The room buzzed with tension. Some engineers leaned forward with curiosity, while others crossed their arms skeptically. Mark Thompson stood at the back, his jaw set tight as he watched the delivery driver he'd dismissed just days ago command the attention of his entire team. I know what you're all thinking, Dan began, his voice steady despite the weight of 20 pairs of eyes on him. What's a delivery guy doing in here with our $1 million project? But sometimes the answer isn't in the complexity, it's in what we're overlooking. Clara stepped forward, her confidence radiating as she addressed her colleagues. Dan's approach addresses the fundamental flaw we've been dancing around for months. The battery drainage issue, the navigation glitches, the payload instability, they're all connected. Mark couldn't contain himself any longer. Clara, I cannot believe you've been working behind my back on this. His voice echoed off the lab walls as he strode toward them. This is my project, my responsibility to the board, and you've compromised everything by bringing in an outsider. An outsider who might actually solve this, Clara shot back, her usually quiet demeanor giving way to fierce determination. We've failed 23 times, Mark. 23! Maybe it's time we listen to someone with fresh eyes. The room fell silent as the two engineers faced off. But Dan stepped between them, his hands raised peacefully. This isn't about territory or titles, he said. This is about making something work that can change how packages reach people in remote areas, in emergency situations. My father always told me that engineering isn't about ego, it's about solving problems that matter. Before Mark could respond, the lab's main screen flickered to life. The company's CEO, Victoria Sterling, appeared via video conference, her expression serious as she addressed the room. I understand we have an unconventional situation here. Mr. Thompson, you've requested an emergency meeting regarding project interference? Mark straightened his shoulders, preparing to defend his position, but the technical director, James Wu, interrupted. Actually, Victoria, I think you need to see what we discovered last night during the preliminary tests. The screen switched to footage from the previous evening. Dan's prototype drone lifting smoothly into the air, its movements fluid and precise as it navigated through increasingly complex obstacles. Unlike the jerky, unstable flights they'd witnessed from every previous attempt, this drone moved with an almost organic grace. That can't be right, Mark whispered, his face pale as he watched the flawless demonstration. The stabilization algorithms alone should have taken weeks to perfect. Dan nodded toward the screen. The algorithms weren't the problem. The problem was treating the drone like a machine instead of understanding it as a complete system. Every component affects every other component, you can't optimize them in isolation. Victoria's voice cut through the murmurs rippling across the room. Mr. Jackson, is it? I'm told you achieved this breakthrough in less than a week? 3 days, actually, Dan replied, his humility evident even as he stood at the center of everyone's attention. But I had help from Clara, and honestly, all the groundwork was already there. Your team had solved individual pieces brilliantly, they just needed to be connected differently. The CEO leaned forward on screen, her interest clearly piqued. Show me. Right now. Live demonstration. Mark felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about his project anymore, his entire career hung in the balance. If Dan's solution worked in front of Victoria, everything would change. But if it failed, the outsider would take the blame, and Mark could maintain his position. As Dan moved toward the control station, Clara whispered urgently in his ear. The board members are all watching this feed. If something goes wrong, then we figure it out, Dan replied quietly, his fingers dancing across the control interface with surprising familiarity. But I've run this sequence 100 times in my head since I was 8 years old, watching my dad fix helicopters. The drone hummed to life, its rotors spinning with a different sound than any of the previous prototypes, smoother, more harmonious. As it lifted off, Mark found himself holding his breath along with everyone else in the room. But just as the drone reached its optimal height, alarms began blaring throughout the lab. Red lights flashed as the building's safety systems detected an anomaly in the test chamber. The drone wobbled dangerously, its navigation system clearly struggling with the interference. Mark stepped forward with a mixture of relief and vindication. System failure, just like all the others. Victoria, I told you this was premature. Wait, Dan called out, his eyes scanning the readouts with intensity. This isn't a system failure. The building's electromagnetic shielding just activated, probably triggered by the storm moving in outside. Clara, can you reroute the secondary stabilizers while I recalibrate the navigation matrix? Working in perfect synchronization, Dan and Clara's fingers flew across different control panels. The room watched in stunned silence as the wobbling drone gradually steadied itself, adapting to the electromagnetic interference in real time. Mark stared at the screen in disbelief, but his expression slowly shifted from skepticism to something else entirely, fear. Because he was beginning to realize that Dan wasn't just lucky or intuitive. The delivery driver was demonstrating a level of technical mastery that surpassed most of his own team. Victoria's voice crackled through the speakers with barely contained excitement. Mr. Jackson, that adaptive response to electromagnetic interference, that's something our engineers have been trying to solve for 2 years. As the successful test concluded and the drone landed softly on its platform, Mark walked slowly toward the back of the room. His shoulders slumped as he processed what had just occurred. Reaching the doorway, he turned back one final time, his voice barely audible as he spoke to no one in particular. The biggest surprise hasn't even hit yet. The boardroom falls silent as Dan stands before the entire engineering team, Clara by his side, holding his prototype drone. Mark Thompson crosses his arms, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. 20 engineers, 3 department heads, and the company's CEO all focus on this delivery driver who claims he can solve what they couldn't. The problem isn't with your battery design or your navigation system, Dan begins, his voice steady despite all eyes on him. You've been trying to make the drone carry more weight by adding more power. But that's backward thinking. He sets his prototype on the conference table. It looks different from theirs, smaller, sleeker, with an unusual curved design where theirs are angular and bulky. My father taught me something when I was 12, working on an old radio in our garage. He said, son, sometimes the smartest solution is the one that does less, not more. Dan's fingers traced the drone's smooth edges. You've been fighting physics instead of working with it. Mark scoffs. Enlighten us then. What brilliant insight did we miss? Dan doesn't flinch at the sarcasm. Instead, he flips his drone upside down, revealing a series of small, flexible panels underneath. Micro air pockets. Your drones create massive turbulence because they're fighting the air resistance. Mine uses it. He demonstrates with his hands, showing how traditional drones push straight down while his design channels air through calculated openings. Instead of brute forcing through wind resistance, these panels redirect airflow to create lift assistance. It's borrowing from bird wing mechanics combined with Formula One aerodynamics. Clara steps forward, unable to contain her excitement. Show them the power consumption data. Dayan activates his tablet. Your prototype uses 60% more battery power than necessary. Mine delivers the same payload weight using 40% less energy, with triple the stability in crosswinds. The room erupts in murmurs. The CEO leans forward, genuinely intrigued. Can you demonstrate this? That's exactly what I was hoping you'd ask. Dayan powers up his drone. The familiar whir begins, but it's quieter, smoother than their prototypes. He launches it from his hands, and it hovers with remarkable steadiness. Mark stands abruptly. This is ridiculous. We've spent months testing every aerodynamic principle known to. His words die as Dayan's drone executes a perfect figure-8 pattern around the conference room, carrying a package that would have destabilized their best prototype. When artificial wind from the air conditioning kicks in, their drones would wobble violently. His doesn't even drift. The reason your tests kept failing, Dayan continues, guiding the drone with precise control, is because you approached it like a helicopter problem. But delivery drones aren't helicopters. They're more like flying leaves, they need to dance with the air, not fight it. He lands the drone gently on the table. The room is dead quiet. The CEO breaks the silence. 20 engineers. 6 months. $3 million in development costs. He looks directly at Dayan. How long did this take you? 3 weeks, working nights after my delivery routes. Dayan's humility shines through. But I had help from Clara, and I built on your research. I just saw it from a different angle. Mark stares at the successful prototype, his face cycling through emotions. Finally, he walks over to Dayan, extending his hand. I owe you an apology. And honestly, I owe you a lot more than that. The handshake is firm, genuine. Your father sounds like he was a wise man, Mark adds quietly. He was. He always said the best engineers are the ones who remember that fancy degrees don't replace curiosity and common sense. The CEO stands, commanding everyone's attention. Dayan, I don't care what your current job title is. As of Monday, you're our new senior innovation engineer, reporting directly to me. Clara, congratulations on recognizing talent when you saw it, you're promoted to project lead. The room bursts into applause. Clara throws her arms around Dayan in a quick hug. I knew it. I knew you had something special. As the crowd disperses, discussing implementation plans and patent applications, Mark approaches Dayan one final time. You know what the most impressive part is? You could have made us all look foolish, gotten revenge for how I dismissed you. Instead, you lifted the whole team up. Dayan shakes his head. My father taught me that too. Success isn't about proving others wrong, it's about proving what's right. 3 months later, Dayan's revolutionary drone design saves the company $12 million in production costs and lands them the largest delivery contract in company history. But for Dayan, the real victory happened that day in the boardroom when 20 engineers looked past his uniform and saw his mind. The lesson his father taught him in that childhood garage had come full circle. Sometimes the most profound solutions come from the most unexpected places, and the smartest person in the room might just be wearing coveralls instead of a suit.